The first thing Ambassador Grenvoth of the Kulvar Collective did when the human delegation walked into the Concord chamber that morning was check the distance to the emergency exit. He had been in interstellar diplomacy for 31 years. He had sat across negotiating tables from 11 different species. He had survived 2 conquered crises, 1 attempted political assassination, and a treaty negotiation with the Vraniks that had gone on so long that he had genuinely begun to wonder if he would die in that room. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a being who frightened easily. But he had also been watching humans for 9 years, which was exactly long enough to learn one thing that no intelligence briefing and no diplomatic handbook had ever thought to include, because the people who wrote intelligence briefings and diplomatic handbooks had not yet made the mistakes necessary to understand it. He had learned to read the signs. He watched the human delegation enter. Secretary General Helena Price was at the front, moving with the particular quality she always had, unhurried, composed, dressed in the dark formal suit that she wore to sessions she considered important. Behind her, General Owen Rask, who commanded Earth's combined fleet theater and who was present at this session in an advisory capacity that everyone in the room understood was not purely advisory. Behind him, 3 aides, 2 legal attaches and a communications officer. Grenvoth studied them with the attention of someone who had spent 9 years developing a skill that no school had taught him. He looked at Secretary General Price's hands, still, controlled at her sides, not clasped in front of her the way they usually were in sessions she expected to be difficult but manageable. He looked at General Rask's face, not the careful diplomatic neutrality he usually wore in conquered chambers, but something that had gone past neutrality into a territory that had no clean diplomatic name. He looked at the aides, who were normally in motion, tablets out, murmuring to each other, doing the continuous low-level information processing that human staff always did. They were completely still. All of them, the whole delegation, moving through the chamber with a quietness that was not calm, not the quiet of people preparing to negotiate, the quiet of people who had already decided. Grenvoth felt something cold move through his secondary circulatory system. He leaned over to his aide, a young Kulvar named Sevari who was on his first major posting and had not yet learned anything, and he said in a voice pitched below the ambient noise of a chamber filling with the delegates of 14 species, "Identify the fastest route to the emergency transport bay." Sevari blinked all 4 of his eyes in sequence, which was the Kulvar expression of confusion. "Ambassador, the session hasn't started yet." "Sevari," Grenvoth said, still watching the human delegation settle into their seats, "in the 9 years I have been working near humans, I have seen them walk into a room like that exactly twice." He paused. "I want you to find the emergency transport bay, and I want you to know exactly how long it takes to reach it from our current position." "What happened the other 2 times?" Sevari asked. Grenvoth picked up his water vessel and took a slow, deliberate drink. "The first time," he said, "the Grethani Compact lost 4 warships and 3 colony installations and formally withdrew from the outer trade corridor they had been disputing with Earth for 6 years. In a single afternoon." He set the vessel down. "The second time, the Parath Syndicate apologized publicly before the session even formally opened, which was the first public apology in Parath diplomatic history, and which was made because someone in their delegation apparently knew what I know and convinced their leadership that getting ahead of it was the only viable option." Sevari was now very still in a way that suggested he was beginning to understand why the stillness of the human delegation was significant. "And what do you know, Ambassador?" Grenvoth looked at Secretary General Helena Price, who had just sat down, who had just placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, who had just looked across the chamber at the empty chairs of the Dravathi sovereignty delegation with an expression that contained nothing. No anger, no impatience, no diplomatic performance of any kind. Just a kind of waiting that had run out of something. A waiting that had become something else. "I know," Grenvoth said carefully, "that when a human delegation is that quiet, it is because they have stopped trying to find another way. He stood up. "Come, Savory. Let us find our seats closer to the exit, and when the session ends or before it ends, depending on how things develop, we are going to move quickly and without requiring any further discussion on the matter." His aide followed him. Around the chamber, most of the other delegates continued their pre-session business, reviewing documents, conferring with staff, watching the chamber fill. A few of them, the ones who had also been in this business for long enough to learn what there was to learn, glanced at the human delegation, and then glanced at each other with the particular expression of beings who are privately recalculating their afternoon plans. The Muran elder Shevath, who had been observing the galactic Concord from a seat of silent wisdom for longer than most of the species in this chamber had been spacefaring, caught Grenvoth's eye from across the room. The elder made a small gesture, a downward movement of 3 fingers, repeated twice, which in Muran communication meant something close to, "Yes, I see it too." Grenvoth nodded. The Drevathi sovereignty's delegation arrived 9 minutes late, which was intentional, which was exactly the kind of detail that anyone watching the human delegation should have understood was going to matter this morning. The Drevathi were tall, gray-skinned, with a bony cranial ridge that served the same social signaling function that eyebrows did in humans, and High Delegate Torn Seville, who led their delegation, had his ridge raised in the particular configuration that communicated to any species that knew Drevathi body language, something between disdain and amusement. He moved to his delegation seats with the unhurried pace of a being who was not concerned about what was waiting for him. He should have been looking at the humans. He was not. He settled into his chair, arranged his documents with deliberate care, and then looked across the chamber at Secretary General Price with an expression of polite, official readiness that contained, if you knew where to look, a thread of satisfaction so fine it was almost invisible. Almost. Grenvoth watched Helena Price look at Torn Seville. He watched what happened to her face when she did. It was not dramatic. It was not visible to anyone who had not spent years studying humans. It was a very small thing, a shift behind the eyes, a barely perceptible settling of something that had already been settled, a quality of arrived, and that was different from the quality of still arriving. He tapped his aide on the arm. 3 minutes, he said quietly. Ambassador. We leave in 3 minutes. Start moving toward the aisle now. Do it slowly so as not to draw attention. Savory looked around the chamber, then back at the human delegation, then at his ambassador, and something connected in his mind in the way things connect when you are young and have been presented with enough data points to form your first genuine understanding of a thing. He stood up slowly and began, with the practiced casualness of someone trying hard to look like they were not in a hurry, to gather his things. The incident that had brought everyone to this chamber had begun 11 days ago, in a way that incidents involving the Drevathi often began, with something that was technically within the boundaries of the agreed-upon rules, and was, in every other sense, completely unacceptable. The Drevathi sovereignty had been in the galactic Concord for 200 years. They were an old species by the Concord standards, not as old as the Sorlians or the Muran, but old enough to have accumulated a particular kind of institutional confidence in their own judgment, and a particular kind of contempt for species newer than themselves. They were not aggressive in the way the HFY had been aggressive. They did not make military moves or territorial grabs that could be challenged in the Security Council, with evidence and depositions. They were subtle. They were patient. They worked in the spaces between the rules, and they were very good at it, and they had been doing it for 200 years to species that were either smaller than them or insufficiently motivated to push back hard enough to make it stop. Humanity had been in the Concord for 11 years. 11 years was, by Drevathi reckoning, approximately the time it took for a young species to finish being impressed by the galaxy and start paying real attention to how it worked. They had been watching humans with careful interest during that time, in the way an experienced player watches a newcomer at a complex game, with patronizing patience, waiting for the newcomer to make the beginner's mistakes, filing away information for use at the appropriate moment. The appropriate moment, Torn had decided 14 months ago was now. The Meridian Corridor was a transit route connecting 17 human colonies to the Concord's main trade network. It ran through a section of space that the Dravathi had quietly, over 8 years, established as a zone of significant commercial interest, not through anything so crude as occupation, but through a series of technical agreements, navigation licensing arrangements, and service contracts that the Dravathi legal apparatus had spent years building into a lattice of overlapping claims. None of the individual claims were problematic in isolation. Together, they created something that the Dravathi's legal team had spent 3 years ensuring was technically compliant with the Concord Charter while being functionally equivalent to a toll booth at the only road into town. 2 months ago, the Dravathi had begun enforcing the lattice. Ships carrying human cargo through the Meridian Corridor were being subjected to inspection delays, legal, under the technical grounds of the service contracts, that added 17 to 22 days to transit times, not enough to constitute an illegal blockade, exactly enough to strangle the commercial viability of the 17 colonies dependent on that route. The humans had protested. They had done it through proper channels, with extensive documentation, through 3 separate Concord committees. Each committee had examined the Dravathi arrangements and reached the same conclusion: technically compliant, regrettable in its impact but within the letter of Concord law. The humans had sent a direct diplomatic communication to the Dravathi sovereignty, requesting renegotiation of the arrangement. The Dravathi had responded with the Concord equivalent of a form letter, polite, elaborate, and completely noncommittal. The humans had requested an emergency session of the full Concord Assembly. The Dravathi had agreed to the session, attended the preliminary hearings, and through a process of procedure and delay and technical objection that their legal team was extraordinarily practiced at, ensured that the session was delayed for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the 17 colonies had continued to bleed. Not dramatically, no one was going to starve, no one's life support was failing, but the economic damage was real and compounding, and behind the economics were people, 80-some-odd thousand of them in the 17 colonies, who were watching the careful machinery of their livelihood slow to a choke under the weight of something that everyone could see was wrong, and that the rules, as written, seemed to protect. This was the Dravathi method. It worked. It had worked on 7 species in 200 years. The cost of fighting it exceeded the cost of accommodation, eventually, for most species, and eventually accommodation became adjustment and adjustment became normalization, and after a generation or two, nobody remembered how it had started, just that this was how things were. Torn had run this play 6 times in his career. He had a strong record. He had not run it against humans before. This, as it would turn out, was an important distinction. Secretary General Helena Price had been 44 years old when she was appointed to lead Earth's diplomatic presence in the galactic Concord. She was 53 now. The 9 years had not made her older in the ways most people expected. She was sharp in a way that time tends to sharpen certain kinds of minds, rather than dulling them, and she had accumulated the particular quality of someone who has spent long enough dealing with complex, high-stakes problems to have burned away everything that is not essential. She was not a soft person. She was frequently described as warm, which was accurate, and frequently described as flexible, which was true in the way that high-tensile steel is flexible. It will accommodate significant force before it stops accommodating. She had spent 9 years building relationships, negotiating outcomes, finding compromises that moved situations toward something better than they had been. She had done it with patience and intelligence, and the genuine quality of caring about the species and the civilization she was trying to help build. She had also spent 9 years watching the Dravathi sovereignty operate in the galactic Concord, and she had a complete and thoroughly documented understanding of exactly what they were doing, and exactly how they were doing it, and exactly what it meant for every species that came after the ones they had already processed through their machinery of technically compliant extraction. She had raised it in 3 committees. She had raised it in private diplomatic channels. She had raised it in a direct written communication to the Dravathi High Council that had been the most carefully worded document she had produced in 9 years of carefully worded documents. The Dravathi had read it, she was certain. They had understood it, she was equally certain. They had done nothing, which was the point. The emergency session was today. In 4 hours of hearings, she was going to present Earth's case, documented, precise, legally argued, and the Dravathi were going to respond with their own documentation and their own legal arguments, and the conquered members were going to listen. And at the end of it, some of them were going to vote one way and some of them were going to vote the other way, and the outcome was not certain. And what was also not certain was whether the outcome, whatever it was, would actually change anything. Because the Dravathi had spent 200 years ensuring that things they wanted to keep did not change. She had known this going in. She had prepared for it. She had 3 escalation paths mapped out in her mind with the thoroughness of someone who had been thinking about them for weeks, and she had been moving toward this session with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who intended to use every legitimate means available before moving to the ones that were less comfortable. Then 10 days ago, she had received a report from the colonies. Not from the Economic Monitoring Team, whose reports she had been reading for 2 months. Not from the Trade Bureau, whose analyses she could have written herself at this point. From the colony administrators. A direct communication, initiated by the administrators of all 17 affected colonies, who had coordinated among themselves and produced a collective document that was not a legal filing or a statistical summary, but simply an account of what was happening to their communities. She had read it at 200 in the morning in her office, with the document on the screen in front of her, and a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink going cold beside her keyboard. The colony on Heifer's Landing had canceled its harvest festival for the first time in 22 years because the economic disruption had affected the local agricultural cooperative's financing, and they couldn't cover the costs. The colony on New Meridian had a children's wing at its hospital that was funded by a medical supply contract that ran through the corridor. The contract was delayed, and the wing was operating at reduced capacity. The colony on Prospect Ridge had a family, one specific family, named in the document by the colony administrator, who clearly felt that the abstraction of statistics was not adequate, who had been trying to get their son's specialized medical treatment on Earth for 8 months, and had been told, twice now, that the transport delay made the appointment window impossible. A family, a boy, a medical appointment, on the other side of a transit corridor that the Dravathi sovereignty had spent 8 years legally and patiently arranging to strangle. Helena Price had sat in her office at 200 and read about that family, and she had felt something shift in her. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, the way things shift when a weight that has been held for a long time finally settles permanently into a new position. She had thought, I am done trying to find the way that costs us nothing. It is time to find the way that costs us something and is still worth it. She had not slept that night. She had spent the remaining hours before dawn making calls. General Owen Rask was the kind of officer who was described in the evaluations that had moved him up through the ranks over 30 years, as measured. The word appeared so consistently that it had clearly communicated something specific to the people writing those evaluations. Not that he was cautious, not that he was slow, but that every action he took had been precisely calibrated to what the situation actually required. No more, no less. He had been measured for 30 years. He had the kind of record that measured people build long, solid, a series of difficult situations managed with minimum necessary force and maximum long-term effect, which is the hardest kind of military judgment to sustain over time, because it requires both the capability to apply significant force and the discipline not to apply it before the moment when it is exactly necessary. Secretary General Price had called him at 3:30. She had told him what she needed. He had listened, asked 4 questions, and said yes. He had then spent the next 10 days doing what measured people do when they have been told that patience is over. He had not been in a hurry. He had been methodical. He had worked through his operations staff with the same steady precision that had characterized his entire career, building what was required, positioning what needed to be positioned, ensuring that when the moment came, it would not be a gesture or a bluff or a demonstration of intent. It would be real. He sat in the conquered chamber now with his hands on the table, and his face in the neutral expression he wore when he was not performing neutrality, but simply had nothing that needed expressing yet. Beside him, Secretary General Price was preparing her opening presentation. On the other side of the chamber, the Dravathi delegation was doing what it usually did, projecting the serene confidence of a species that expected to prevail because it had always prevailed. He looked at Torn Seville once briefly and then looked back at the documentation in front of him. He thought about the boy on Prospect Ridge. He thought about the medical appointment. He thought about 11 days of work. He was ready. Elder Shevath of the Muran had been present at enough historical inflection points to have developed a practiced eye for them. The Muran were the oldest spacefaring species in the Concord, older than the Sorlians, older than anyone else at the table, and Shevath was old even among the Muran, which meant that the breadth of what she had personally witnessed exceeded the written history of several of the younger species in the room. She did not speak often in Concord sessions. When she did, the room tended to stop what it was doing. She had been watching humanity with great attention for 11 years, since before they signed the Concord Treaty, since before most of the current member species had taken them seriously. She had watched with the particular quality of interest that comes from long pattern recognition, from having seen, across centuries, the signatures of species that were going to matter and the signatures of species that were not. She had seen, in humanity, something that she had seen only 3 other times in her very long life, something that she did not have an efficient word for in Muran or in the Concord standard linguistic framework, but which she privately thought of as the quality of irreducibility. A thing that could be pressured and tested and pushed, and that would accommodate pressure up to a point, and then simply would not go further, not from stubbornness, not from rage, but from a deep structural integrity that was as fundamental as the composition of a material. The point at which you are not bending something anymore but breaking it, and breaking it produces results very different from bending. She had watched the Dravathi push against this quality for 11 months. She had watched with concern, not for Earth. Earth, she thought, was quite capable of managing its own affairs, but for the Dravathi, who were good at reading species that worked like they did and had demonstrated, across 200 years, a complete inability to correctly read species that did not. She had mentioned this, diplomatically, to a Dravathi acquaintance 6 months ago. The acquaintance had listened politely and said something that translated roughly as, "We appreciate the Muran's long perspective but feel confident in our assessment of the situation." Shevath had nodded and said nothing further. She had been at this long enough to know when advice had arrived at a wall. Now she watched the Concord chamber fill, and she watched Ambassador Grenvoth of the Culvar quietly relocate his delegation closer to the exit, and she watched the human delegation sitting with their particular quality of finished deciding, and she thought, here it is then, the moment. She was, among other things, curious. She had not seen this specific version of the pattern before. She knew the shape of what was coming from its outlines, but the specifics of how humanity chose to express this particular quality, the irreducible point, the place where accommodation ended, would be new information, and new information was rare at her age and therefore precious. She settled back in her chair, adjusted her translator to its most sensitive setting, and waited. The session opened. The Concord chair, a Pelhari delegate named Oren Seva, who ran sessions with the methodical fairness characteristic of her species, called the chamber to order. She acknowledged both delegations and invited Secretary General Price to deliver Earth's opening statement. Price stood. She had delivered 1,000 opening statements in 9 years. They had varied in tone, length, approach, and rhetorical strategy according to what the situation required. This one was unlike any of them. It was short. "Thank you, Chair Oren Seva," she said. I appreciate the Concord's time today. I'm going to keep my opening brief because I think the situation is already well understood by everyone in this room, and I don't want to waste anyone's time restating what everyone here has read in the filings. She looked at the chamber, a small pause. The Dravathi sovereignty has used a technically constructed legal arrangement to effectively blockade 17 Earth colonies. They have done this with considerable skill. The arrangement is, as 3 Concord committees have confirmed, technically compliant with the letter of Concord law. It is also completely inconsistent with any honest understanding of what the Concord is supposed to be. Everyone in this room knows that. Another pause, she let it sit. We have pursued every available channel in good faith over the past 9 months. We have documented the impact on our colonies. We have proposed renegotiation. We have requested committee review. We have asked for this session. At every stage, the Dravathi delegation has responded with the kind of procedural engagement that has the external form of good faith participation and the internal substance of delay. She looked at Torn Seville directly. I'm not saying that as an accusation. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because I think accuracy serves everyone better than diplomatic softening at this point. Torn Seville's cranial ridge shifted slightly. Not concern, something more like reassessment of calibration. She was being more direct than his modeling had suggested. I want to be honest with this chamber, Price continued. We came here today expecting a session that would produce another round of procedural engagement. We came prepared for that. We also came with a decision that we have already made, and I want to be transparent about it so that no one in this room is surprised later. She looked around the chamber. Every delegate was paying attention. Some of them had the expression of beings who had heard the particular register of what she was saying and were now paying attention in a different and more focused way. If today's session does not produce a genuine, substantive, and immediately enacted resolution to the Meridian Corridor situation, she said, Earth will be withdrawing from the Meridian arrangements entirely and establishing independent transit infrastructure that bypasses the corridor. We will be doing this unilaterally, without Concord approval, at whatever cost is required. We will be doing this because 17 communities of human beings are being deliberately strangled by a legal construction that was designed to be impervious to the legitimate processes we have been using for 9 months. And we will be doing it because the boy on Prospect Ridge needs to see a doctor. She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. The overlapping sounds of 14 species delegates processing what they had heard, translators working, aides leaning toward principals. Torn Seville's cranial ridge was fully elevated now. Not concern, something else. He raised a formal objection point, which Chair Seville acknowledged, and he stood and said, in the measured tones of someone who was still confident of his position, that the Secretary General's characterization of the Dravathi's legal arrangements was inaccurate, that the Dravathi had engaged fully and in good faith with all appropriate Concord processes, and that unilateral action outside the Concord framework would itself constitute a violation of the Charter, for which there were established consequences. He used the word consequences with a particular emphasis. It was subtle, it was there. Helena Price's expression did not change. Grenvoth, from his repositioned seat near the aisle, noticed that it did not change. He leaned toward his aide and said very quietly, "Find Chair Seva's emergency recess button on your session interface. I want you to be able to reach it within 2 seconds. Ambassador, you can't call a recess on behalf of another delegation." I am not going to call a recess. I am going to be ready to ask Chair Seva to do so the moment I judge it necessary. He watched Price and Rask and the still human delegation. That moment may come quickly. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not, technically, unusual. It was a formal Concord session. There were arguments and counterarguments, legal citations, procedural motions, points of information. The Dravathi delegation was exactly as skilled as they always were, responding to every point with prepared, technically grounded counterpoints, maneuvering in the parliamentary space with the ease of 200 years of practice. But something was different, and the delegates who were paying careful attention could feel it, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before weather arrives. The human delegation was not matching the Dravathi move for move in the procedural space. They were allowing the procedural arguments to pass, recording their objections cleanly and briefly, and not engaging in the extended back-and-forth that Tornsevel's strategy depended on. They were, in a word, not being drawn in, and their refusal to be drawn in had a quality to it that was different from the refusal of a delegation conserving its energy for a later argument. It was the quality of people who were not interested in the argument anymore. General Rask had not spoken at all. He was sitting with his communications tablet open on the table in front of him, and he was not using it, and everyone who looked at him for long enough noticed this and could not have explained why it was significant but felt that it was. At the 41-minute mark, Tornsevel made what he considered his decisive move. He presented a counter-proposal, a modified inspection protocol that would, according to the Dravathi's projections, reduce transit delays in the Meridian Corridor from 17 to 22 days to 12 to 15 days. It was dressed up in the elaborate language of good faith compromise. It was, stripped of that language, an offer to make the stranglehold slightly less tight. He presented it with the expression of a being extending significant generosity. Helena Price looked at the proposal. She read it. It took her approximately 90 seconds. Then she set it down on the table in front of her, flat, and she looked at Tornsevel, and she said, in a voice that was completely level and entirely without anger and utterly clear, "High Delegate Tornsevel, I want to make sure you understand something, because I want there to be no confusion about this later. We are not here to negotiate a reduction in the degree to which you are strangling our colonies. We are here because you have been strangling our colonies, and it needs to stop." A pause. "You have taken something that doesn't belong to you, wrapped it in paperwork, and called it legal. We have been polite about it for 9 months because we believe in these processes and we believe in this institution, and we wanted to give them every reasonable chance to work." She looked at him steadily. "You have pushed it further than any of that can accommodate. You have genuinely pushed it now, and I need you to understand what that means." She stopped talking. The chamber was very, very quiet. Grenvoth was already standing. His aide was standing beside him. Across the room, he saw the Pelhari delegation's second attaché lean over to whisper something in the head delegate's ear. He saw 2 of the Greven delegates who communicated by electrical impulse, exchange, a rapid burst that their translators rendered only as urgent. He saw Elder Shevath, ancient and still in her chair, watching with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and was now watching it happen with complete, collected attention. Chair Oran Seva had straightened in her chair. She was looking between the human delegation and the Dravathi delegation with the expression of a being who has suddenly understood that what she thought was a difficult session is something categorically different. Tornsevel's cranial ridge was doing something that, in Dravathi body language, corresponded to processing an unexpected variable. He had prepared for this session with thoroughness. He had modeled the likely arguments, the probable procedural moves, the range of human responses from diplomatic protest to formal complaint. He had been fairly certain that the most aggressive outcome of this session was a fractious procedural vote that the Dravathi legal apparatus could manage through appeal. He had not modeled this specific quality of quiet. He recognized, with the instinct of an experienced diplomat, that he had encountered a tone he did not have a reference point for. He reached, professionally, for the response that had served him in similar unfamiliar territory before, the measured, authoritative assertion of position. "Secretary General Price," he said, "I appreciate the directness. I want to be equally direct. The Dravathi sovereignty's arrangements in the Meridian region are lawful under the Concord Charter. Earth's threat of unilateral action represents a potential violation of the same charter, for which there are formal processes and formal consequences. I would encourage the Earth delegation to consider those consequences carefully before." "General Rask," Helena Price said. She did not look at Rask when she said it. She kept looking at Tornsevel. General Owen Rask picked up his communications tablet. He pressed two controls. He set it back down. "The Concord is now receiving a transmission from Earth's Combined Fleet Command," he said. His voice had the quality of someone reading a weather report, clear, complete, without editorial comment. "It contains the current deployment positions of Earth's 4th, 6th, and 9th Fleet elements, which have been repositioning over the last 11 days. Also the activation status of the Meridian Construction Initiative, which is an infrastructure project that Earth has been developing, and that will be operational in approximately 90 days. He paused. "The transmission also contains the formal notification that Earth is invoking the Concord self-help provision under Article 7, Clause 4, the provision that allows a member state to take unilateral protective action when established processes have demonstrably failed to address ongoing harm, with the documentation of process failure attached." A pause that lasted about 3 seconds, which in a room full of professional diplomats was a very significant amount of time. "Meridian Corridor Transit Operations," Rask continued, "will return to prearrangement status effective immediately. If they do not, the infrastructure project proceeds. The fleet elements are in position to ensure its completion, and the Earth-Dravathi commercial relationship across all current active agreements will be suspended pending a full Concord review of the Dravathi sovereignty's compliance history." He looked at Torn Seville for the first time. That review request was filed this morning. The documentation is approximately 14,000 pages. He stopped talking. The sound in the chamber was extraordinary. Not loud, in fact. It was the particular sound of many beings being very quiet in ways that expressed different things, overlapping into a texture that was somehow more intense than noise. Torn Seville was very still. His cranial ridge had done something that Dravathi body language scholars, reviewing the session recording later, would describe as the configuration associated with encountering a physical barrier, where open space had been expected. His legal team was in rapid, visible consultation. One of his aides had placed a hand on the table in front of him in a gesture that looked like steadying. He looked at Helena Price. She looked back. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. He looked at General Rask. Rask looked at him with the measured expression of a man who had spent 30 years developing exactly this quality of measured expressiveness for exactly this kind of moment. Torn Seville looked at the chamber around him. He looked at the Muran elder, who was watching with that complete and collected attention. He looked at Ambassador Gren Voth, who was standing near the aisle with his aide, and who met Torn Seville's gaze with an expression that the Dravathi High Delegate was not entirely sure how to read, but that contained something he recognized, after a moment, as the expression of a being who has seen this before. He looked, finally, at his own legal team. His senior legal attaché made a very small gesture, a slight turn of the hand, palm up, that in Dravathi internal communication meant something close to. The mathematics have changed. Torn Seville sat back in his chair. He said to the room, in the careful voice of a man making a decision he will need to explain to his government, "I would like to request a 30-minute recess for consultation." The recess lasted 47 minutes. What happened during those 47 minutes, in the small consultation rooms off the main chamber, would become the subject of considerable analysis in the months that followed, as the people who had been present wrote their accounts and the species that had been watching wrote their assessments. What was clear was this. The Dravathi legal team spent approximately 18 of those 47 minutes reviewing the Article 7 filing and the supporting documentation. They spent approximately 12 minutes in communication with the Dravathi Sovereignty's government on the secure channel. They spent the remaining 17 minutes in internal discussion, of which no recording exists. What came out of those 47 minutes was a Dravathi delegation that walked back into the Concord chamber, and for the second time in Dravathi diplomatic history, the first having been the incident with the Parath Syndicate in a different chamber 22 years ago, which was itself considered remarkable, formally acknowledged that their arrangements in the Meridian region had produced outcomes inconsistent with the spirit of Concord membership, and proposed an immediate, full, and unconditional return to prearrangement transit conditions. No modified protocol, no reduced delay, no partial accommodation, a complete withdrawal of the arrangement. Chair Seva accepted the proposal. She looked somewhat surprised. She recovered quickly because she was good at her job. General Rask sent one message on his communications tablet. It was short. Secretary General Price accepted the Dravathi proposal on behalf of Earth. She did it with a simple acknowledgement, no editorial, no expression of satisfaction. She noted that she appreciated the Dravathi delegation's willingness to resolve the situation, and that she hoped the resolution marked the beginning of a different approach to the commercial relationship between their two civilizations. Torn Seville, who had spent 40 years in the Dravathi diplomatic service, and had never once in that time offered an acknowledgement of error in a public forum, said that he too hoped the relationship could develop on a different basis going forward. He said it with the expression of a being who has made a correct assessment late and knows it, and is filing the lesson somewhere it will not be easily retrieved. The session ended. The chamber began to empty in the way chambers empty at the end of sessions, gradual, delegates pausing to speak to each other, aides gathering documents, the ambient noise of administrative aftermath. Ambassador Grenvoth found himself beside the human delegation's exit path. He had not specifically arranged this, but he did not move out of the way either. Secretary General Price, walking past, stopped. She looked at him. He was, he knew, an old acquaintance. They had been in enough sessions together over enough years for the relationship to have substance. Ambassador, she said. Secretary General, he said. He paused. I notice your delegation relocated near an exit before the session began. He paused again. Then he said, because he was old and had no patience left for excessive indirectness, there is something I have been wondering about for 9 years, and I would like to ask you about it directly. Go ahead, she said. Is it deliberate? He asked. The quality, the quiet. The way your delegation was when it came in this morning. Is that something you choose? Do you practice it? He looked at her. I ask because I have seen it 3 times, and each time I have recognized it, and I have never been certain whether I was recognizing something that humans do intentionally or something that simply happens. Helena Price looked at him for a moment. Then she said, both, I think. He considered this. What do you mean? We're a species that feels things very intensely, she said. We have a lot of internal, whether anger, grief, frustration. When something has gone on long enough that we've worked through all of that and come out the other side, it gets very quiet. She looked at the chamber, now mostly empty, the chairs and the documents and the physical evidence of what had just happened. That's the genuine thing, the quiet. It's not a technique. But you know what it looks like, he said. We've learned what it looks like, she corrected gently. 11 years of being in this building. Yes, she looked at him. Why? Because I have wondered, he said, whether you know what it does, what it communicates to species that have been paying attention. She looked at him with the expression of someone who knows the answer to a question, but is interested in hearing what the other person says about it. What does it communicate? He thought about how to say it accurately. It tells us, he said slowly, that we have arrived at the place where you have stopped calculating and started deciding, and that the decision has already been made. He paused. It is, Ambassador, Secretary General, the most frightening thing I have seen in 31 years of this work. Not because it is aggressive, because it is not. It is simply certain. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Grenvoth, do you know how many 9-year-olds are on Prospect Ridge? He blinked, no. About 600, she said. One of them has a spinal condition that requires specialist treatment that he cannot get on the colony. His parents have been trying to get him to a specialist on Earth for 8 months. The corridor delays have canceled his appointment twice. She paused. That's what being pushed too far looks like from our side. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like this cannot be allowed to be true. And once it feels like that, the calculation is finished and the decision is done. He was quiet for a moment, and the frightening quality is probably, she said, What it looks like when a species that is capable of a great deal chooses, very deliberately, not to be angry about something, because it is past anger, and does what is necessary instead. He thought about this. He thought about the Grethani Compact and the Parath Syndicate and what he had personally witnessed in this chamber this morning, and he thought about 31 years of diplomacy, and he thought about the moment when a river stops accommodating the shape of the land and begins changing it. Secretary General, he said, I want to make you aware of something as a colleague. Go ahead. This session will be discussed, he said, at length, by every species in the Concord. The Dravathi withdrawal, the manner in which it was achieved, it will be studied. He paused. There are species in this Concord who will look at what happened here and see a lesson about confronting humans directly, and there are species who will look at it and see a lesson about not starting what was started here in the first place. I know, she said. I want you to know, he said carefully, that I have been telling the second story to anyone who would listen for 4 years. Not because of any particular affinity, though I have developed one, but because it is the accurate story. The Dravathas' mistake was not in how they handled this morning. Their mistake was in beginning, in looking at your civilization and deciding it could be processed through their usual machinery. She nodded. We're not trying to be intimidating, she said. We're trying to be consistent. Consistent is actually more useful. Yes, he said. Although from the outside, he added, with something in his voice that was very close to wry, the distinction can be academic. She smiled slightly. Fair point. Elder Sheveth found General Rask near the chamber exit. She was very small beside him. The Murren were not a large species physically, and she had the quality of great age that is sometimes described as shrinking, but was, in her case, more accurately described as concentrated. A reduction of everything unnecessary until what remained was the essential. Rask saw her coming and stopped walking, which was the appropriate response to being approached by the oldest individual in the Galactic Concord. General, she said. Elder Sheveth, he said, I'm honored. She looked at him for a moment with the amber eyes of her species, which were large relative to her face, and which had, in Rask's experience, the quality of taking in more than they appeared to. I have a question, she said. I will be direct, because at my age directness is the kindest approach. Please, he said. The fleet movements, she said. The 11 days, the infrastructure project. Were those prepared before or after the Secretary General made her decision about this session? He looked at her steadily. Before, he said. Meaning the decision preceded the session by how long? The decision, he said carefully, was an ongoing process. The specific conclusion was reached several weeks ago. She nodded slowly. How many weeks? He looked at her, the ancient face, the amber eyes, the concentrated quality of someone who had been asking questions like this for longer than his civilization had been spacefaring. How much time would you need to build a bypass infrastructure for a major transit corridor? He said. She made a small sound that might have been in another species a laugh. I see, she said. The session this morning was an opportunity, he said, for the situation to resolve itself correctly before it needed to resolve itself differently. He paused. We were glad it worked. She looked at him for a long moment. You were ready for it not to work. We are always ready for it not to work, he said. That's not something we're proud of. It's something we believe is necessary. He paused. The preparation is what makes the session possible. The session is always the preferred outcome. She was quiet. Then she said, General Rask, in 500 years of observing this institution, I have seen 11 species join the Concord. I have watched each of them find their way here, their own particular way. The manner in which a civilization presents itself in the first decades, it tends to be a reliable indicator of what it will be. And he said, I am glad you are here, she said simply. It was said without elaboration and without qualification, and with the weight that comes from 500 years of knowing what to be glad about and what not to be. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, Thank you, Elder. She inclined her head, and walked away in the direction of her own delegation. The report reached Torn-Seville on his transport back to Dravathi space. It was from his senior analyst, and it was titled, in the dry language of Dravathi intelligence documents, Assessment Revision, Earth Military Posture and Strategic Capacity. He read it with the careful attention he gave to everything, and then read it again, because on the first reading he had not been certain he was interpreting the numbers correctly. He was interpreting them correctly. The fleet elements that General Rask had mentioned, 4th, 6th, 9th, represented a deployment of Earth's conventional military forces. They were, according to the analysis, sized and positioned for the specific operational requirements of protecting the infrastructure project. They were not the most that Earth could put in the region. The analysis also contained, in its appendices, an updated estimate of Earth's total military capacity, which had been revised upward from previous Dravathi estimates by a figure that Torn-Seville reread 3 times. He set the report down on the desk in his private cabin. He looked out the viewport at the stars moving past at transit speed, the quiet, meaningless sweep of them, and he thought about the session. About Helena Price setting down his counterproposal flat on the table and looking at him. About the quality of stillness in the human delegation. About the word, genuinely. You have genuinely pushed it now. He had heard the phrase and processed it as rhetoric, the kind of escalatory language that delegations used when they wanted to signal seriousness without taking action. He had processed it incorrectly. He understood that now. It had not been rhetoric. It had been information, offered clearly and once, in the same way that a structural engineer might tell you once clearly that a load-bearing wall is exactly that. He thought about the 6 previous times he had run this particular strategic sequence. He thought about the species he had run it against, and the way those situations had resolved, and the pattern that had produced his confidence in the method. He thought about the 8 years of careful preparation that had gone into the Meridian arrangements, and the legal architecture that had withstood 3 committee reviews, and the procedural management that had delayed the session for 6 weeks. He thought about 90 days, the infrastructure project, operational in 90 days. They had been building it for months, possibly longer. The 11 days of fleet repositioning had not been preparation for this session. They had been positioning for what came after this session if the session failed. The session had been, in the Secretary General's phrase, an opportunity, a last chance. He had almost missed it. He had, in fact, been prepared to miss it, had come to this session expecting to manage it procedurally, to emerge with his arrangements intact, to treat the human delegation's seriousness as a performance. He had been saved from the consequences of that error by something he had not modeled and would need to think carefully about. The quality in Helena Price's face when she set down his counter-proposal. The thing he had not been able to read because he did not have a reference for it in his experience with any of the 11 species he had dealt with across his career. He pulled the analysis back up and read it a 3rd time. He read the numbers. He read the projections. He read the appendix that contained the intelligence team's update to the assessment of human strategic patience. The willingness to wait, to prepare, to allow things to develop at whatever pace was necessary without revealing the depth of preparation. And he read the note at the end that said, previous estimates assumed that human diplomatic behavior reflected strategic limitation. Revised assessment. Human diplomatic behavior reflects strategic choice. The 2 things are different in ways our modeling did not adequately account for. He filed the report. He opened a new document. He began to write the internal review that he would present to the High Council when he returned. He wrote at the top, "We were wrong about what we were dealing with. We were wrong in a specific way that we need to understand precisely so that we do not make this class of error again." Then he stopped and looked at the words. He had been in the Dravathi diplomatic service for 40 years. He had written many reports in that time. He had never before written one that began this way. He decided not to change it. The boy on Prospect Ridge was named Caleb Torres. He was 9 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and a spinal condition called degenerative scoliosis that had been manageable for the first 7 years of his life and had gotten less manageable in the last 2. He had not known, when his parents' faces had gone through a series of emotions one evening that he was old enough to notice but not yet old enough to fully read, that something important was happening. He had not known about the Meridian Corridor or the Dravathi sovereignty or 11 years of Earth's presence in the galactic Concord. He had known that he was supposed to see a doctor on Earth who had a treatment that might help his back stop hurting as much as it did, and that the trip had been canceled twice, and that his mother had the expression she got when she was working very hard not to show him something she was worried about. 3 days after the Concord session, his mother came into his room with a different expression, the kind that she used to have more often before the past year or so, the one that was real in a particular way, that meant something that was actually happening rather than something being managed. She said they had a new appointment date, 6 weeks. The corridor was open. He said that was good, because his back had been bad this week. She sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his shoulder, and for a moment her face did the thing that faces do when they have been holding something for a long time and can put it down. He was old enough to see that, even if he was not old enough to understand everything behind it. He said because he was 9 and because he had his father's directness, "Were you worried about it?" She said yes. He said, "What happened? Did someone fix it?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about colony administrators and relay stations and Concord chambers and fleet movements and ancient Murran elders and a secretary general who had read about a boy with a spinal condition at 2 in the morning and felt something settle permanently into a new position. She said some people did their jobs really well. He nodded in the way of a 9-year-old accepting an answer that covers the main point. "Okay," he said. Then, because he was also his mother's child, "Can I call Grandma and tell her we're coming?" She said yes. She stayed on the edge of his bed while he called his grandmother on the colony's communication network, and she listened to him explain with the characteristic directness of 9-year-olds. "I'm coming to Earth. Mom said we're really coming this time. Yes, for real, Grandma. Yes, for real." And the maple tree in the botanical garden on a different colony in the same corridor network turned red in its engineered autumn outside a window. And the stars above Prospect Ridge were the same stars they always were, unremarkable and vast, and full of things that humanity was still learning about the world it had joined. In the Concord chamber on Vethara Prime, the session records were filed. The Dravathi withdrawal was logged. The Article 7 invocation was noted. The documentation, 14,000 pages of it, was received into the Concord's permanent archive, where it joined the treaty signed 11 years ago, and the clause that said what it said, and the growing history of what happened when people decided to find out whether it was true. Elder Shevath returned to her chambers after the session and sat in the particular chair she had sat in for 50 years, in the particular quality of light she had arranged around herself across all those years, and she thought about what she had seen that morning. She thought about Grenvoth moving his delegation closer to the exit before the session began. She thought about the human delegation's stillness. She thought about General Rask and the word before. She thought about 11 species who had joined the Concord in her time, and the signatures she had learned to read, and the qualities she had been trying to name for 11 years that she now felt she was slightly closer to naming. She thought about a river, the old analogy used by her species for longer than most civilizations had existed, for the thing that is gentle until it is not, and that does not stop, and that finds the way through, and that the land always learns about eventually, one way or another. She thought that it was not quite right, close but not quite. The thing about a river was that it was indifferent. It did not choose to be gentle. It was shaped by whatever it was shaped by, and the gentleness was a property of that shaping, and the force was a property of the same shaping. Humans were different. The gentleness was a choice. The care was a choice. The extraordinary and persistent generosity towards strangers, the healing and the sharing and the showing up, was something they picked, every day, for reasons that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with something older than that, something that ran underneath the calculation and could not be removed from it. And the other thing, the stillness, the quiet, the fleet elements repositioned over 11 days, the infrastructure project 90 days from operational, the 14,000 pages of documentation, that was also a choice, just as deliberate, just as deeply felt. The river analogy failed because a river does not love the valley it runs through. Humans loved the things they protected. The love and the capability were not separate. They were the same thing viewed from different angles. That, Sheveth thought, was what every species learned eventually when they had been in the conquered long enough to learn anything real. That was what the Dravathi had learned this morning, at cost. That was what Grenvoth had understood from watching for 9 years and had tried to explain in words that could only approximate it. Never mistake kindness for weakness, 4 words in the treaty. She had thought about them many times. She had thought they were a warning. She had been right, but not entirely right. They were also a love letter, a statement of intent. This is who we are, fully all of it together at once. The thing that tends gardens and the thing that guards them. The thing that shows up for strangers and the thing that absolutely will not let strangers be taken from. The thing that grieves and the thing that acts on the grief. Both sides the same coin. She thought, in 500 years, I have been waiting to see a species that understood this. That was not one thing or the other thing, but both, genuinely and simultaneously, and did not think there was a contradiction in that. She had 11 years ago looked at a young civilization arriving at the conquered's door, pen in hand, treaty clause in the document, and she had thought, here it is, perhaps. This morning she thought, yes, here it is. She settled back in her chair. Outside, the triple suns of Vethara Prime were moving through their afternoon positions, the light shifting through the colors that had no names in human languages, the light that fell on the conquered hall and all of its 400 years, and everything that had happened in it and was still happening. She thought about a boy named Caleb Tors, who would travel from a colony at the edge of human-occupied space to see a doctor on Earth in 6 weeks, and who did not know that his name was in a report that a secretary general had read at 200 in the morning, and that the reading of it had moved something in a human being from one position to another, and that the movement of that thing had resulted in this morning, in this chamber, in this particular moment in history that she would be thinking about for the rest of her very long life. She thought that it mattered, the specific person, the specific name, the specific back that hurt. That it had not been abstract principle that had produced this morning, but a real boy with real pain and parents with real fear, and that somewhere in the human capacity to hold that realness, to not let it become abstract, to not let the machinery of civilization grind it into policy language until the person disappeared, was the specific thing that the Dravathi and the HFY and every other species that had made this particular error had failed to understand. You could not separate the kindness from the consequence. They came from the same place. They were fueled by the same thing. And the thing they were fueled by was not weakness. It had never been weakness. It was precisely, exactly the opposite.